Welcome back to the Veil. Tonight, we are beginning a journey into a single point in time. We are moving past the headlines and the short clips to sit in the humid, heavy air of 1977. We are going to the Pará region of Brazil, specifically to a small, isolated island town called Colares. If you are listening to this while you work or relax, I want you to imagine the sound of the Amazon River, the constant, low-frequency hum of the jungle. Now imagine that hum being interrupted by something that sounds like a swarm of bees, but made of metal and electricity. In the summer of 1977, the people of Colares stopped being afraid of the dark and started being afraid of the light. They called it Chupa-Chupa. In English, that translates roughly to the sucker. It sounds like a folklore legend, but the scars it left were very real. Witnesses described small metallic objects, sometimes circular, sometimes shaped like a cask or a cylinder, that would hover just above the tree line. These objects didn't just observe, they hunted. They would emit a thin, concentrated beam of green or intense white light. This beam was so precise, it could pass through the thatched roofs of houses, seeking out the people sleeping inside. But this wasn't just a light show. When the beam touched human skin, it didn't just burn, it seemed to extract. Victims reported an intense sensation of heat, as if their blood was being brought to a boil. Many were left with small circular puncture marks, identical to the marks left by a needle. In the days following these encounters, the victims suffered from extreme fatigue, massive hair loss, and a strange, sudden onset of anemia. It was as if the objects were literally harvesting biological material from the terrified villagers. The terror became so widespread that the town of Colares entered a state of collective psychosis. People stopped sleeping in their beds. They would gather in large groups on the streets, lighting bonfires and banging pots and pans, desperate to keep the vampire lights at bay. Men would take turns standing guard with old hunting rifles. But how do you shoot a light that moves faster than a jet? How do you fight something that seems to ignore the very laws of physics? The local doctor, Welaide Sesim Carvalho, began to see a surge of patients. She was a woman of science, trained to look for logical explanations. But as she treated dozens of people with identical radiation like burns and unexplained blood loss, her logic began to fail her. She noted that the victims weren't just physically injured, they were psychologically shattered. They spoke of the objects as having a will or an intelligence. They weren't just machines. They were entities that seemed to be conducting a mass biological survey of the human population. As the weeks turned into months, the Brazilian government could no longer ignore the panic. The local authorities were overwhelmed. The mayor was pleading for help. Reports were flooding in from neighboring towns, Bahia do Sol, Santo Antônio do Tauá, and Mosqueiro. The phenomena was spreading like a virus across the coast of Pará. It was then that the Brazilian Air Force decided to intervene. They launched a classified mission that would become the most documented military UFO investigation in history. They called it Operação Prato, Operation Saucer. Leading this mission was a man named Captain Uyrangê Hollanda. At the time, he was a skeptic. He was a professional military officer, trained in intelligence and tactical operations. He believed he was going to the Amazon to debunk a case of mass hysteria, or perhaps identify secret foreign technology. He had no idea that the mission would consume the rest of his life. He had no idea that he was about to step behind a veil that would never truly close again. In this first chapter of our deep dive, we have to understand the weight of the atmosphere. The footage I've recorded for you, the shifting shadows and the vast open sky, is exactly what the people of Colares were staring at in 1977. They were looking for a sign, and what they found was a predator. As we prepare to move into the military's actual arrival on the island, keep those victims in your mind. Keep the Chupa-Chupa in your mind. This wasn't a story for them. It was a survival situation. In the next chapter, we will look at the arrival of Captain Hollanda and the first night the military actually caught the light on film. we will look at the secret sketches hidden in the Air Force archives and the moment the skeptics became believers. The files are open. The frequency is set. Let the echo of 1977 take hold. 1977, the terror in Colares was no longer a local mystery. It was a national security crisis. The Brazilian Air Force, or the FAB, realized they were losing control of the narrative in the Amazon. This birthed Operação Prato, Operation Saucer. Led by Captain Uyrangê Hollanda, a specialized team descended upon Colares. They didn't arrive with a sense of wonder, but with high-speed cameras, theodolites, and a military-grade skepticism that was about to be dismantled piece by piece. Captain Hollanda's orders were clinical. Identify the source of the lights. Command in Brasilia suspected clandestine foreign drones, perhaps American or Soviet, testing high-energy weapons. The team established a base on the coast, positioning observers along the Baía do Sol. Initially, they saw nothing but the vast, humid darkness of the jungle. They listened to stories of vampire lights with polite military detachment, but that detachment vanished on the fourth night. Hollanda recorded in his logs a bright yellowish-white object descending from the high atmosphere. It didn't fall like a meteor. It moved with a terrifying, intelligent grace. It stopped abruptly, hovering just a few hundred feet above the water, and began to pulse. The light was so intense, it illuminated the bay as if it were midday. It made no sound. To Hollanda, the silence of the craft was its most unnatural characteristic. The team began a frantic effort to document the phenomena. Using 35mm cameras and 16mm film, they captured hundreds of photographs. These weren't blurry blobs. They were structured shapes. Some were classic saucers, while others were massive, cigar-shaped motherships that hung in the sky like silent, metallic clouds. Hollanda reported smaller, faster probes exiting these larger crafts, zipping to the river's surface, and returning. The military was watching a coordinated, high-tech operation far beyond any human capability of the 1970s. The investigation took a darker turn as they tracked the Chupa-Chupa beams. They observed objects firing pencil-thin rays into the forest. Following these beams, Hollanda's men found locals in a state of collapse. Military doctors corroborated Dr. Carvalho's findings. The beams caused physical trauma. One sergeant witnessed a beam hit a woman's shoulder. By the time he reached her, her skin was blistering, and her eyes were glazed as if she had been drugged. Hollanda became obsessed. He moved his base closer to the water, spending nights on a small boat in the bay. He wanted to know why. Why Colares? Why these people? He noticed the objects favored the deep, muddy waters of the river. They submerged and emerged without a splash, suggesting transmedium crafts capable of moving between air and water without resistance. Documents from this period, many classified for 30 years, show a military struggling to name what they saw. They used terms like luminous phenomenon, but in private, the tone was different. They were witnessing a survey. They felt like ants under a magnifying glass. The objects weren't just visiting, they were mapping. They were taking samples of the water, the animals, and most disturbingly, the humans. As weeks passed, Hollanda felt a strange psychological pressure. He reported feeling called to certain locations, having inexplicable urges to look at specific parts of the sky, only to find an object already there, as if waiting for him. His skepticism hadn't just evaporated, it was replaced by existential dread. He realized the veil he was sent to defend was non-existent. The entities behind these lights weren't hiding. They simply didn't care that the military was there. The footage I've recorded for you tonight, the moon reflecting off the water, evokes that sense of being watched. Imagine standing on a pier in Colares, heart racing, knowing a craft in that black sky can see your pulse. Captain Hollanda was no longer just an investigator. He was a participant in a mystery he couldn't solve. And Brasilia was getting nervous. They didn't like the reports. They wanted answers that fit into a box, and Hollanda was giving them a universe. In the next chapter, we will discuss the mothership encounters, massive crafts that dwarfed military aircraft. We will look at the specific sketches Hollanda made of the occupants he claimed to see through transparent domes. The investigation was reaching its peak, and the vampire lights were about to show the Air Force exactly how powerless they truly were. As November 1977 arrived, the sightings over the Amazon shifted. The small zipping probes the locals called Chupa-Chupa were no longer the only actors on this stage. Captain Hollanda and his team began to document what military logs called great luminous bodies. These weren't just lights, they were architectural marvels. Hollanda described encounters with crafts hundreds of meters long, massive silent cylinders hanging vertically in the sky, defying gravity with a casual, almost mocking ease. One night near Bahia do Sol, Hollanda's team tracked a craft the size of an oil tanker. It hovered over the bay, reflecting a golden yellow glow onto the water so intense that jungle birds began to sing as if it were dawn. But the most shocking part wasn't the size, it was the proximity. A smaller, saucer-shaped craft detached from the main cylinder and descended toward their position. For the first time, the military wasn't just observing, they were being approached. This is where the veil truly tore for the Air Force team. Hollanda claimed that through the transparent upper domes of these smaller crafts, he saw figures. He described them as humanoid, but with fluid, almost mechanical movements. They wore tight-fitting, dark suits and visored helmets. He didn't see little green men. He saw operators, a crew. He sketched these figures in his notebook with a trembling hand. Drawings leaked decades later, proving the Brazilian military had looked into the eyes of the unknown. The physical toll on the team was undeniable. Hollanda suffered from chronic headaches and a metallic taste in his mouth after close-range encounters. One sergeant, caught in the path of a low-flying object, experienced temporary paralysis that lasted for hours. The air around the crafts seemed ionized, creating magnetic fields that interfered with compasses and radio equipment. They were operating in a zone where 1970s physics simply did not apply. The mothership encounters changed the scope of the mission. Hollanda reported seeing a massive craft emerge from the Amazon River itself. It rose from the depths as if the water offered no resistance, no wake, no splash, and no sound. This suggested these entities were masters of both sky and water. This transmedium capability mirrors what modern Navy pilots report today, yet Hollanda documented it in the jungle nearly 50 years ago. Psychological pressure reached a breaking point as the objects began to interact with the military. Hollanda recorded instances where crafts mimicked the team's light signals. If the military flashed a light 3 times, the craft pulsed 3 times in return. It was a game of cat and mouse, played at the speed of light. The Air Force was no longer investigating a phenomenon. They were engaged in silent communication with a non-human intelligence that seemed to mock their attempts to categorize it. In Brasilia, High Command grew increasingly disturbed. Hollanda's reports were becoming longer, more detailed, and far too unbelievable. He was no longer providing dry technical data. He was providing a narrative of contact. He spoke of beings and telepathic urges. The military hierarchy, fearful of public disorder and their own lack of defense, made a fateful decision. Hollanda had seen too much. The footage I've recorded, silhouettes of trees against the fading light, mirrors that feeling of being dwarfed by something much larger than yourself. Captain Hollanda, a man of military action, was forced to accept he was a primitive observer in the presence of a superior force. The vampire lights weren't just hunting villagers anymore. They had captured the attention of the state, and the state was terrified. In the next chapter, we will discuss the sudden, mysterious shutdown of Operação Prato. We will look at the missing files, the hundreds of photographs and hours of film that disappeared into Air Force vaults. And we will move forward to 1997, to the final interview Captain Hollanda gave before his life came to a tragic, mysterious end. The mission didn't end in 1978. It merely went underground, In the final weeks of 1977, Operação Prato was operating at peak intensity. Captain Hollanda's team had collected over 500 photographs, hours of 16mm film, and a mountain of physical evidence ranging from soil samples to medical reports. They were on the verge of a breakthrough that could have changed human history. And then the order came from Brasilia. Shut it down. Immediately. The shutdown was not a gradual withdrawal, but an extraction. High-ranking officers arrived in Colares to secure every roll of film, notebook, and technical log. Hollanda was ordered back to the capital, and, more importantly, ordered to forget. The official reason was a lack of resources and a conclusion that the sightings were atmospheric phenomena, or mass hallucinations. But Hollanda knew better. You don't send a specialized military task force to investigate a hallucination, and you certainly don't classify the results for 30 years if there's nothing to see. For the next 2 decades, Operação Prato became a ghost story within the Brazilian Air Force. Hollanda continued his military career, eventually rising to colonel, but the weight of what he witnessed never left him. He watched in silence as his painstakingly prepared documents were buried in archives. He watched as the victims in Colares were left without answers, their scars fading, but their trauma remaining. The Great Silence had begun, and the veil was pulled tighter than ever. But truth has a way of breathing, even under military cover-up. In the mid-1990s, a wave of transparency hit ufology. In 1997, after years of private torment, Uyrangê Hollanda decided he could no longer remain a guardian of the secret. He reached out to prominent Brazilian UFO researchers, Ademar José Gaverde and Marco Antonio Petit. In a series of explosive, hours-long interviews, the man who led Operation Saucer finally told the world what really happened in the jungle. Hollanda's testimony was a revelation. He didn't just talk about lights. He described the physical reality of the crafts. He told how they would hover over military tents so close the wind from their propulsion shook the canvas. He spoke again of the beings, describing them as roughly 1.5 meters tall, with large, dark eyes and skin covered in gray protective suits. He admitted the military had tracked these objects with radar, confirming maneuvers that made the fastest jets in the world look like toys. Perhaps most shockingly, Hollanda admitted he believed the objects were interdimensional. He felt they weren't traveling across space traditionally, but were bleeding into our reality. He spoke of a psychological connection with the entities, claiming they knew exactly when he was going to film them. This was no longer a military report. It was the confession of a man who realized humanity was not the master of its own house. But speaking out came with a terrible price. Just months after his interviews were recorded and the story broke globally, the world was stunned. Uyrangê Hollanda was found dead in his home. The official ruling was suicide. To skeptics, it was a tragic end for an obsessed man. But to those who knew him and the researchers he had entrusted with his work, the timing was far too convenient. The death of Hollanda turned Operação Prato from a mystery into a conspiracy. Did he take his life because the echo of what he saw was too much to bear? Or was he silenced because he was preparing to reveal more? Perhaps the location of the confiscated films, or the names of officials still in contact with the phenomena. The vampire lights had claimed their most high-profile victim, and the files were pushed back into the shadows. The footage I've recorded, the steady eye of the moon over the trees, is a reminder of the unknown's persistence. Captain Hollanda gave his life to tell a story the world wasn't ready to hear. He tried to tear the veil, and the veil pushed back, but the echo of his voice remains. It's in the documents declassified by the Brazilian government under public pressure. It's in the sketches we see today. In our final chapter, we will look at what has happened since. We will examine the 2004 and 2005 releases of the Operation Saucer files and what they reveal about the military's true conclusions. And we will ask the final question. If the vampire lights were there in 1977, are they still there today? Is the Amazon still a laboratory for a non-human intelligence? And are we still the subjects? The death of Colonel Uyrangê Hollanda in 1997 did not bury Operação Prato. Instead, it acted as a catalyst. For years, the Brazilian public and the global UFO research community demanded the truth. They wanted to see the documents that Hollanda had died trying to protect. Under the pressure of a massive public campaign known as UFOs, Freedom of Information Now, the Brazilian government finally began to blink. In 2004 and 2005, the veil was partially pulled back. The Air Force began releasing thousands of pages of previously classified documents, hundreds of photographs, and the official maps of the 1977 encounters. When researchers finally got their hands on the Prato files, the scale of the investigation was staggering. The documents confirmed everything Hollanda had claimed. There were detailed technical charts of the craft's flight paths, medical dossiers on the victims, and most importantly, the official military conclusions. The Air Force didn't call them hallucinations. They called them unidentified aerial phenomena. The files revealed that the objects had been tracked not just by the eyes of soldiers, but by the sophisticated radar systems of the time. The military had officially documented objects moving at speeds exceeding several thousand miles per hour, making 90-degree turns that would crush any human pilot under the force of gravity. But even with the release of these thousands of pages, there is a sense that the heart of the mystery remains locked away. The hours of 16mm film that Hollanda described, the clear close-up footage of the Motherships, and the transparent domes have never been made public. The Air Force claims they were lost or destroyed, but many believe they are still held in a deep state vault, far beyond the reach of transparency laws. We have the what, but the government is still hiding the why. Why were these entities so interested in the blood of the Amazonian people? And why did the investigation stop just as it was becoming most successful? Today, if you travel to the island of Colares, the echo of 1977 is still very much alive. It has become part of the town's identity. There is a monument to the Chupa-Chupa in the town square, and the older generation still talks about that summer with a hushed, reverent fear. But the most disturbing aspect of the modern era is that the sightings haven't actually stopped. Locals still report strange lights emerging from the river and silent crafts hovering over the jungle canopy. The Amazon remains a hotspot, a laboratory where the boundary between our reality and theirs is uniquely thin. The legacy of Operação Prato is a reminder that we are not the sole masters of this planet. We live in a house with locked doors, and in 1977, the Brazilian military realized that someone else has the keys. Captain Hollanda's journey, from a skeptical military officer to a man who sacrificed his reputation and ultimately his life to tell the truth, is the ultimate behind-the-veil story. He proved that the phenomenon is not a myth. It is a physical, measurable reality that can interact with us, study us, and ignore our defenses at will. The footage I've recorded for you, the slow, steady movement of the clouds over the Amazonian landscape, is intended to be a visual meditation on this mystery. As the sky turns to black, realize that the vampire lights don't need to be invited. They don't care about our borders or our laws. They operate on a timeline and a logic that is fundamentally non-human. When you look at the stars tonight, remember the people of Colares. Remember the scars on their skin and the fear in their eyes. The echo isn't just a recording of the past. It is a warning for the future. We have reached the end of this 30,000 character map of Operation Saucer. We have walked through the terror of the villagers, the obsession of the military, the silence of the cover-up, and the tragedy of the whistleblower. But the file isn't truly closed. It can't be. Not as long as the lights continue to rise from the river. Not as long as the veil remains. Thank you for staying with me through this feature-length exploration of the Amazon files. If this journey has changed the way you look at the night sky, then our mission is a success. Share this story, keep the memory of Hollanda alive, and never stop questioning what moves in the shadows. This has been Beyond the Veil Files. I am your host, and the truth is no longer just out there. It is right here, waiting for us to be brave enough to look. Stay curious, stay aware, and keep watching the horizon. The veil is always thinner than it looks.